The community hall was warm and bright that night. Fairy lights stretched along the ceiling beams, casting a soft glow over the wooden floor. People moved between the rows of chairs, holding coffee cups and small plates of cookies, laughing in clusters while the open mic host prepared the next act. The scent of fresh pastries mixed with the faint aroma of brewed coffee, giving the whole place a cozy feeling. Near the back of the hall, almost hidden in the corner, sat a young woman with a guitar case resting upright beside her chair. It was small in frame, shoulders slightly hunched forward, like she was trying to make herself invisible. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the floorboards, avoiding the curious glances of anyone who passed by. She kept both hands wrapped around the neck of the guitar case, as if she feared it might slip away. From a distance, she didn't seem like someone who belonged on a stage. While the other performers moved about with easy smiles, greeting friends, and joking with the host, she stayed quiet, her lips pressed together, her expression guarded. A few people noticed her and whispered, wondering if she was a newcomer. Nobody seemed to know her. The host's voice called over the microphone, "Next up." There was a pause as he glanced at the card in his hand. "We have our final performer before the break." He read her name, and a murmur ran through the room. Heads turned toward the back, searching for the face to match the name. Her grip tightened on the guitar case. For a moment, she didn't move. The applause that followed was polite, uncertain, the kind that came when the audience didn't know what to expect. She rose slowly, smoothing her sleeves with trembling hands. The short walk to the stage seemed like a long road, each step deliberate. Careful, as she reached the small wooden platform, she didn't step into the center right away. She lingered near the side, adjusting the strap of her guitar case before setting it down. The quiet rustle of people shifting in their seats filled the gap. She lifted the guitar from its case, her hands steady enough to clip the strap in place. But the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed her nerves. She stood in front of the microphone stand, not quite looking at the audience, not quite looking away. The microphone was a little too high. She lowered it slowly, the metal stand squeaking slightly in the quiet. Somewhere in the back, someone cleared their throat. A few people exchanged glances. She hadn't said a word yet. The room felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Even the host, who had stepped aside, stopped shuffling his notes and looked at her with quiet curiosity. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and placed her left hand lightly on the neck of the guitar. Her right hand hovered above the strings for a moment before making a single, deliberate strum. The sound that filled the hall was unexpected. It wasn't loud, but it was pure, warm, and full, ringing across the wooden walls like it had been waiting for the right moment. Conversations stopped. The clinking of cups at the refreshment table froze mid-motion. People leaned in without even realizing it. She took a slow breath, letting the strings hum for a moment longer before pressing her fingers into a soft chord. Another strum followed, and another, each one steady, each one pulling the room further into silence. Then she sang. Her voice was gentle at first, almost fragile, like she was speaking to herself. But there was a kind of honesty in it, a tone that made you feel you should listen closely. She didn't force the sound. It flowed naturally, as if the melody had been living inside her for years. In the second row, a man who had been glancing at his phone looked up and kept looking. In the back, a young couple who had been whispering to each other stopped mid-sentence. The woman at the coffee table lowered the pot she was pouring from, just listening. The first verse carried a kind of quiet strength. It spoke of late nights, under streetlights, of walking home alone, of holding on to small moments when the rest of the world felt too heavy, even without knowing her. The audience could feel that the song meant something real. As she moved into the next line, a shift happened in her posture. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes lifted, though not all the way to the crowd, as if she was beginning to trust herself. Her voice gained color, the notes bending slightly with emotion. The guitar and voice blended together in a way that felt natural, like they belonged to each other. It wasn't a showy performance. There were no big gestures, no dramatic pauses for effect. It was something quieter, the kind of performance that reaches people without them realizing until they're already leaning forward in their seats. When she reached the chorus, Her fingers moved with more confidence across the strings. The melody rose, and for a moment the hall seemed smaller, more intimate. Like they were all in a single shared space where nothing else outside mattered. By now, the nervous girl in the corner was gone. In her place stood someone who belonged to the song completely. And yet, there was still something delicate in the way she played. A carefulness that made each note feel like it had been chosen with care. The first note had changed the room. No one was whispering anymore. No one was thinking about their coffee or their phones. Every eye was on her, and every ear was tuned to the sound of that guitar and the voice that carried through the hall. And as she played on, it became clear. This was more than music. This was her moment, and somehow everyone knew it. The air inside the community hall had shifted. It wasn't something you could see, but everyone could feel it. The small sounds that usually filled the space, the shuffling of feet, the tapping of rings against coffee cups, the creak of old wooden chairs were gone. The first note from her guitar had stolen them all away. She stood there on the stage, a single spotlight brushing across her face. The rest of the hall was dim, faces hidden in soft shadow, but she could feel them. Watching it wasn't the kind of attention that made her nervous anymore. It was different. It was quiet, focused, almost gentle. Her voice still steady now, carried over the room like it had been waiting for this exact space to exist. She wasn't pushing for volume. She didn't need to. Every person leaned forward without even realizing it, pulling the sound closer in the front row. A man who had been smiling politely during the earlier performers now had his chin resting in his hand. His brow furrowed slightly. Beside him, a woman with a knitted scarf pulled tighter around her neck had her eyes fixed on the stage, her coffee cooling in her lap. The song's second verse began to unfold, each word shaped with care. She sang about nights where the street was empty except for the sound of her own footsteps. About a small kitchen with one flickering light bulb, where she had sat on the floor playing the same 3 chords over and over until they felt like home. About how sometimes the only thing keeping her together was the sound of her own voice in a quiet room, the way she told it. The details didn't feel like just hers. They felt borrowed from the listener's own memories, from the times they had felt alone, from the places they'd once kept secret. It was as if she was holding up a mirror and letting everyone see a piece of themselves, reflected in her words. Somewhere near the middle of the crowd, a teenage boy who had been recording her on his phone forgot to hold it steady. The video would later show the camera slowly drifting toward the floor, the lens still picking up her voice as if even the device was drawn into the sound. At the coffee table in the back, the volunteer who had been refilling cups all night stood. With the pot in her hand, steam curling upward, her eyes locked on the girl's face. She didn't move until the chorus swelled again, and even then, she poured slowly, careful not to let the clink of the cup break the spell. Every now and then, her gaze would lift just enough to meet the eyes of someone in the audience. It was never held for long, a second, maybe 2, but it was enough to create an unspoken connection.
Ow.
Those who caught it felt as though she had chosen them in that moment.
Ow.
Like the song was reaching across the space just for them. The guitars. Notes were simple, almost minimal, but the warmth in them made it impossible to turn away. She wasn't showing off with fast runs or complicated progressions. She was letting the spaces between the notes do as much work as the notes themselves. That was what made it feel alive. As the bridge approached, her voice dropped slightly, almost to a whisper. It made the crowd lean even closer, breaths held. The words came slower now, each one landing like it carried weight. She sang about the feeling of standing at the edge of something, not knowing if it was a beginning or an ending. And then, just as the last line of the bridge slipped into the air, she let her fingers fall into a single, slow strum. The sound rang out like the toll of a distant bell. In that pause, no one clapped, no one spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from boredom. It was the kind that comes when no one wants to break what's happening. She lifted her eyes again, and for a moment, she seemed to truly see the audience, the rows of faces, the stillness, the attention. Maybe it was then that she realized she had them, not because they were being polite, but because they were with her completely. The final chorus came, and this time her voice grew. It didn't shout. It expanded, reaching further into the room, pulling everyone with it. A woman in the third row brushed a tear from her cheek without looking away. A man in the back straightened his posture, his arms unfolding from across his chest. By the time the last chord of the chorus faded, the room felt different from when she had first stepped on stage. The polite smiles and quiet chatter from earlier were gone, and the audience seemed to be holding on to the sound, hoping it would last just a little longer. The song wasn't over yet, but already something had changed in them and in her. The first two verses had caught the audience's attention, but now, as she began the next part of her song, it became clear this wasn't just music. This was a story. Her voice carried a kind of honesty that made people forget they were sitting. In a crowded hall, it felt like she was speaking directly to each person, telling them something she had never told anyone before. She sang about the kind of moments that don't make the headlines, the small details of an ordinary life that somehow mattered the most. About sitting in the back seat of an old car, watching rain streak down the glass, while the world outside blurred. About hearing laughter in another room, but feeling too far away to join in. About that one song on the radio that made you pull over just to listen, because you couldn't drive, while feeling so much all at once. Her words painted pictures, and those pictures seemed to live in the minds of the people listening. In the front row, a man closed his eyes, and for him, the song carried him back to a night he hadn't thought about in years. In the corner, a young woman bit her lip and tilted her head, as if trying to catch every syllable. The melody rose gently, wrapping around the story like it was protecting it. Her guitar playing stayed simple, steady, almost like a heartbeat beneath the lyrics. She didn't rush. She let the song breathe, giving space for the listeners to fill in the blanks with their own memories. It was then that a woman sitting near the middle of the hall leaned toward her friend and whispered, "It's like she's lived my life." Her friend didn't answer. She was too busy watching the stage, her coffee forgotten on the floor by her feet. The song shifted into a chorus again, and this time there was a subtle change in her tone. It was warmer now, carrying the faintest trace of hope. She sang about how, even on the hardest nights, there's always one small light, maybe a memory, maybe a person that keeps you from falling all the way into the dark. And as she sang, people believed her. In the back row, an older man who had been slouched in his chair sat upright. He didn't realize his fingers were tapping lightly on his knee, matching the rhythm. Nearby, a teenager who had been scrolling through her phone earlier now held it in her lap, screen black, her attention completely on the stage. It wasn't a loud song, but it was full. Every note seemed to carry weight, the pauses between. Her phrases felt just as important as the phrases themselves, as though the silence gave the audience permission to feel whatever they needed to feel. Somewhere in the middle of the second chorus, a light rain began tapping softly against the tall windows of the hall. It was faint at first, almost hidden under the music, but it seemed to fit like nature itself, and decided to add to the story she was telling. She didn't flinch when a note came out slightly rougher than the rest. Instead, she leaned into it, letting it add texture, like a scar on a photograph that makes it more beautiful. Her voice had the kind of imperfections that made it believable. It didn't sound like someone trying to impress. It sounded like someone trying to be heard. Eyes moved over the crowd again, but this time she seemed to see them differently. She wasn't avoiding their gaze anymore. She met it, even if only for a second. When her eyes landed on a middle-aged woman near the aisle, the woman felt her chest tighten, as if the line she was singing right then had been written just for her. The bridge of the song arrived, and her words became sharper, more personal. She sang about a night when she had packed a bag but never walked out the door. About the way the world can feel too big, but also too small, all at the same time. About how sometimes you only realize you're strong because you had no other choice. By now, the audience was fully inside the song. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was an exchange. She gave them her story, and in return they gave her their silence, their attention, their understanding. The guitar's tone softened as she approached the final lines of the bridge. Her voice lowered again, almost to a whisper, and the hall leaned in with her, The rain outside tapped a little louder, as if keeping time. Then came the last chorus, this one fuller than the rest, her voice rising without strain, carrying more than just words. It carried something unspoken, the kind of emotion you don't have to name for people to feel. When she reached the last note, she didn't let it go quickly. She held it just long enough for it to settle in the air like a final breath. Then she let it fade. No one clapped right away. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. The kind of silence that comes when people are caught between where they are and where the music took them. And as she stood there, guitar still in her hands, she realized this wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to them too. The last note had barely faded when she glanced across the room, and for the first time that night she truly saw them. Not as a faceless crowd, but as individuals, each carrying their own stories, their own reasons for being here. In the front row, a man with graying hair sat with his hands clasped in front of his mouth. He had been leaning forward since the first verse, his elbows resting on his knees. His eyes were red at the edges, but he didn't look away. He wasn't just listening to her. He was somewhere else entirely, pulled back to a night from his. Past that, only he could see. Beside him, a woman in a knitted scarf held a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold. She didn't drink it, didn't even notice it anymore. Her fingers were curled tightly around the cup, as if she needed to hold something to steady herself. Every so often she blinked hard, like she was chasing away a memory that hurt to hold on to for too long. A few rows back, a teenager sat cross-legged on her chair, phone resting on her thigh. The screen was dark, untouched since the second verse. She hadn't planned to care about tonight. She'd come because her friends wanted to. But somewhere in the middle of the song, she stopped thinking about leaving. Now her lips moved softly as she mouthed along to the chorus she had only just learned. On the far side of the room, a man in a faded jacket stood near the wall. He had been restless earlier, shifting from foot to foot, but now he was still, eyes locked on the stage. He looked like someone who had worked all day and come here just to pass time, but now something in his face had changed. There was a weight in his expression, like the music had opened a door he hadn't realized was closed. Near the back, a young mother sat with her daughter on her lap. The little girl's head rested against her chest, and her small hands tapped against her mother's arm in rhythm with the song. The mother smiled faintly, not the polite kind of smile, but the kind that came when you felt seen, even if no one had spoken directly to you. And then there was the man by the door, the one who had almost left before she began. He had been glancing at his watch earlier, thinking about the long drive home. But now he stood with his hand resting on the doorframe, his whole body turned toward her. He wasn't thinking about leaving anymore. As she scanned the room, she caught the gaze of the music teacher sitting in the third row. His arms were crossed loosely, his head tilted as he studied her with the quiet focus of someone who knew what it took to stand where she was. He wasn't just hearing her voice. He was reading the small details, the way her fingers pressed, the strings, the way she controlled her breath, the way her eyes softened at certain lines. He didn't look away when she glanced his way, just gave the smallest nod as if to say, "Keep going." The song carried on, each note weaving its way through the different lives in the room. She didn't know their stories, but she didn't need to. She could see them written in their faces, in the way they held themselves. Some leaned forward like they were trying to get closer. Others sat completely still, as if afraid to move and break whatever they were feeling. A woman near the aisle dabbed the corner of her eyes with a tissue. She had come tonight with friends, expecting an evening of light entertainment. She hadn't expected to hear words that matched the ones she had written in her journal years ago. The rain outside tapped a little harder on the tall windows, the sound blending with her guitar. It was a soft rhythm, almost like applause from somewhere beyond the walls. She let it mix with the music, as if it belonged there. Every face in the room told her something. Some were wide-eyed, leaning forward, drinking in every sound. Others seemed far away, eyes glazed, traveling through memories only they could see. She realized then that the song wasn't just about her anymore. It had turned into 100 different songs, one for each person listening. She felt a shift in herself too. The stage no longer felt like a barrier between her and them. It felt like a bridge. The nerves she'd carried from the corner of the room to the microphone had melted away, replaced by a steady kind of courage. When she reached the end of another verse, she let her gaze settle briefly on the young mother and child. The girl was looking up at her now, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe a person could make that sound. The mother noticed and smiled, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. The girl on stage smiled back. It was quick, small, but it was there the first time she'd let herself do it all night. And in that moment, she wasn't thinking about the strangers in the room, or the fact that she'd almost been too scared to get up here. She was thinking about how right now someone out there, maybe a child, maybe an adult, was hearing something they needed. By the time the verse ended and she moved into the bridge, the faces in the crowd didn't feel like an audience anymore. They felt like part of the song itself. When she first stepped onto the stage, fear had clung to her like a second skin. It had been in the way her shoulders curled in the way her eyes stayed down, in the way her fingers trembled against the guitar strings. But now, standing under the soft light with the sound of her own voice filling the room, she could feel that fear loosening its grip. Something had shifted. Somewhere between the first verse and the bridge, the tight knot in her chest had begun to unravel. It wasn't gone. Fear never disappeared completely, but it no longer felt like it was controlling her. Now it was just a quiet voice in the corner, easy to ignore when the music was louder. She took a breath, deeper than any she'd dared since she stepped on stage. Her shoulders lifted, then fell slowly, her lungs filling with air that tasted like possibility instead of panic. She pressed her fingers against the strings, finding the next chord without hesitation. Her voice came out stronger now, not because she forced it, but because she allowed it. The nerves that once made her voice shake were now giving it an edge of rawness, the kind that made every word sound real. The melody didn't just flow anymore, it soared in the crowd. They could hear the change. People felt it without needing to name it. The shy girl from the corner was gone. In her place was someone who belonged on that stage. Someone who wasn't hiding anymore. She began to move slightly as she played. Not in a planned way, but in the way music naturally carries. A person, a gentle sway, a small tap of her foot against the wooden floor. It made her feel grounded, as if the stage itself was keeping her steady. Her eyes lifted more often now, meeting the gaze of those in the front rows. She didn't look away quickly anymore. She let the connection linger, letting the audience see that she wasn't afraid of them, not now. A man in the third row noticed and gave her the smallest smile. She returned it without thinking. The exchange was quiet, unspoken, but it carried a simple truth. She was no longer performing at them. She was sharing with them. Her hands stopped shaking. The pick glided smoothly over the strings, the sound, rich and steady. She allowed herself to lean into the higher notes, letting her voice stretch without worrying if it was perfect. Perfection wasn't the goal anymore. Honesty was in the back. Someone started recording again. This time, the phone stayed steady. The person holding it seemed to know they were capturing something that wouldn't happen the same way twice. She reached the song's most vulnerable line, the one that had always been the hardest to sing. In the past, her voice would catch. Here, not from lack of skill, but from the weight of the words. Tonight, she let it come out exactly as it was meant to. The note wavered for a heartbeat, then steadied, stronger than before, and in that moment, the fear broke completely. She felt it leave in the way her chest lightened, in the way her fingers moved without second-guessing, in the way her voice filled the hall like it belonged there. The girl who had sat in the corner, clutching her guitar case, would hardly recognize the woman standing here now. The audience felt it too. They leaned forward as one, caught up in the shift, drawn into her newfound confidence. It wasn't about playing louder or faster, it was about presence. She was here now, fully, and they could feel it. The guitar solo she had always played quietly, almost shyly, now came out clear and full. Each note rang in the air with certainty, like a statement instead of a question. Her right hand moved with ease, her left hand sliding across the neck of the guitar without hesitation, The bridge came again, and this time she let her voice swell with the chords, letting the emotion in the song rise to its highest point. It was instinct, and the audience followed her there, breathing with her. Hearts rising with the music. She didn't notice it, but a few people were swaying in their seats now. Some had closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others were still, but their stillness wasn't from distance. It was from being completely inside the moment. Her final chorus felt different from all the rest. She sang it like someone who knew they had already given everything but still had just a little more to offer. The notes stretched longer, the words landed deeper. She wasn't afraid of how she might sound. She trusted the song to carry her. When the last chord came, she didn't rush it. Her fingers pressed it firmly, letting the sound ring out into the hall. She held it until the vibration faded into silence. And when she finally lowered her hand, she stood still, breathing. In the quiet that followed, for a heartbeat, she thought the applause might not come. But then, like a wave, breaking, it rose loud, warm, unrestrained. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was the kind of applause people give when they've been moved. And she stood there, no longer nervous, just grateful. Not for the applause itself, but for what it meant. She had faced the fear, and this time, she'd won. The last chord lingered in the air, warm and full, vibrating through the wooden floorboards. She kept her fingers pressed to the strings, holding it there for just a few seconds longer than necessary, as if she didn't want to let it go. It was the kind of sound that wrapped itself around the room, refusing to fade too quickly. When she finally lifted her hand, the silence that followed was almost startling. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full, heavy with everything that had just happened. Every person in that hall seemed to hold their breath, as if speaking too soon would break something fragile. For a brief moment, she stood still, guitar resting against her hip, eyes lowered. Her heartbeat was slowing now, but it still pounded. In her ears, she could feel the warmth of the stage lights on her skin, could feel the faint tremble in her legs from standing so long without moving. And yet, she felt steady then. The applause began. It started with a single pair of hands in the back, one person clapping firmly with purpose. Then another joined, then another, until the sound swelled and spread across the entire hall. The quiet broke into a wave of cheers, whistles, and clapping that rolled toward the stage like a tide. She looked up, startled. She had expected polite appreciation, maybe a few nods, but this was more. People were standing now, first in small groups, then row after row, until nearly everyone was on their feet. She didn't quite know what to do. For a second, she smiled without meaning to, the kind of smile that starts small but refuses to stay that way. She stepped back from the microphone, almost as if she needed space to take it all in. From the stage, she could see faces more clearly now. The man with the gray hair was on his feet, clapping hard, eyes still damp. The young mother was standing too, her daughter perched on her hip, little hands smacking together in an unsteady rhythm.
Ow.
Where we? Above her head, clapping and cheering like she'd been waiting for this moment all night. It was overwhelming, not in the way the nerves had been earlier, but in a way that filled her chest until she thought it might burst. She stepped forward, again, leaning into the microphone just enough to say a quiet thank you. Her voice was soft, but it carried. The clapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. The music teacher in the third row raised his hand in a small gesture of respect, as if to say, "You did it." She caught it and gave a small nod in return. Someone in the back shouted, "Encore!" "Ah!" and laughter rippled. through the crowd, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that mocked. It was joyful. The sound of people who didn't want the moment to end. She didn't have another song prepared. This was supposed to be it, her one chance to see if she could even get through a performance without freezing. And yet here she was, not only having made it through, but standing in front of an audience that didn't want to let her go. Her fingers tightened gently on the neck of the guitar. Part of her wanted to keep playing, to ride the wave of energy that filled the room. But another part of her, the part that had learned to savor rare moments, knew this was the perfect place to stop. Let the night end on a note that couldn't be improved by adding more. So instead, she lifted the guitar strap from her shoulder and held the instrument carefully by its neck. She gave the audience one last look, not a quick glance, but a slow sweep across the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. Her smile was different now. It wasn't shy, and it wasn't surprised. It was a smile that understood something had happened here, something worth remembering. She stepped back from the mic again, nodded once more, and then turned toward the side of the stage. The applause followed her, even as she began walking toward the steps. Halfway down, she paused. The sound of clapping and cheering washed over her, and she turned her head. Taking one last look at the space she had just filled with music, it struck her then that the stage no longer looked like a place for other people. It didn't seem distant or unreachable anymore. It looked possible. As she stepped off the last stair, the host appeared with a wide grin, clapping as he leaned toward her. "That," he said over the noise, "is what these nights are all about." She didn't know how to answer, so she just nodded, her throat tight. She walked back toward her guitar case in the corner, the same corner where she had sat, frozen with nerves, less than an hour ago. The applause was still going as she placed the guitar carefully inside. When she finally sat down, the sound began to fade, replaced by the hum of people talking again, voices buzzing with what they had just seen. But she knew, and they knew, that for those few minutes on stage, something rare had happened. She had played the final chord, but the night wasn't over. Not for her. Not for them. The applause faded, but the energy in the room didn't. Conversations picked up again, yet many voices still carried the same breathless tone, like people were speaking about something fragile. Afraid to disturb it too much, she sat in her corner, guitar now safely in its case, her hands resting loosely on her lap. The stage lights had been turned toward the next performer's setup, but she still felt the glow of them on her skin. Like an echo that hadn't quite left, she thought. She might be able to slip out quietly once the night ended. She didn't expect anyone to notice her leaving. But before she could even think about standing up, a man approached her. He was the one from the front row, the one with gray hair and tired eyes. Up close, she could see the deep lines on his face, the kind that spoke of years lived with both joy and weight. He stopped just in front of her chair and cleared his throat. "That," he said slowly, "was the first time in years a song made me think of my wife." He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to.
Ow.
His voice carried. All the rest, the love, the loss, the memory. She nodded, unsure if words would even be enough, before she could respond. Another person stepped forward, a woman in the knitted scarf who had sat beside him. She smiled gently and added, "You have a gift. Don't ever let it go quiet." Moved aside, and almost immediately, the young mother with her daughter appeared. The little girl was clinging to her hip, wide-eyed, still staring at the guitar case. "She's been asking about you since you finished," the mother said. "She wants to know if you've always played like that." The girl shook her head before she could answer, speaking in a small, certain voice. "No," she said. She played like she meant it. That made her laugh, a soft, genuine laugh she hadn't expected to find tonight. "Thank you," she told the child. People kept coming. A teenager approached shyly, hands stuffed into the pockets of her hoodie. "I was going to leave before you started," she admitted, looking down. "I'm glad I didn't." The man in the faded jacket, the one who had stood at the back, simply offered his hand. "You made me remember some things I'd put away," he said. "Not all of them were easy, but thank you." Even the music teacher approached, moving slowly through the small crowd that had gathered around her. Do you write your own songs? He asked. She nodded, unsure where this was leading. You should keep writing them, he said firmly, almost like an instruction, and you should play more. You belong up there. Those words hit her differently than the rest. Had been afraid to admit to herself that she wanted to belong up there. Hearing someone else say it, someone who clearly knew music, felt like permission to keep dreaming. The local radio station host, a tall man with a warm smile, slipped her a small card with his number on it. If you ever want to share? That song again, he said. I've got a mic and an audience who would listen. It was almost too much to take in. Just an hour ago, she'd been certain she might not even get through one song. Now, strangers were speaking to her like she had given them something that mattered. In between the conversations, she noticed something else. People weren't just thanking her for playing. They were telling her why the song had meant something. To them, a man talked about driving alone across 3 states after losing his job, with nothing but the Radio 4 company. A woman spoke about leaving her hometown at 17, carrying only a small bag and a guitar she didn't know how to play yet. Each story felt like a small thread, and she realized her song had somehow pulled all of these separate threads into the same place. Eventually, the crowd around her began to thin as the night moved on. People found their seats again, or drifted toward the refreshment table. She sat back, letting the quiet settle around her once more. The host passed by and leaned down briefly. You coming back next month? He asked casually. She hesitated for only a moment. Maybe, she said, though deep down. She knew the answer wasn't maybe anymore. When the evening ended and people began to file out into the cool night air, several stopped by her corner one last time, offering small waves or quiet thank yous. The young girl from earlier even slipped a folded piece of paper into her hand before leaving. Outside, the streetlights cast long pools of gold on the wet pavement. She stepped out with her guitar case in hand, the night air cool against her face. Opening the paper, she saw a drawing, a stick figure version of herself on a stage, holding a guitar with small circles for the people clapping below. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, it read, "Don't stop playing." She stood there for a long moment, staring at the paper. The street was quiet, except for the sound of cars in the distance and the soft dripping of rain from the roofs. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about what could go wrong. She was thinking about what could happen if she just kept going. Weeks had passed since that night at the community hall, but for her, it was still fresh, every detail, every sound. Every look from the crowd replayed in her mind like a scene she couldn't stop returning to. The fairy lights strung across, the beams, the soft hum of conversation before her name was called. The way her hands had shaken so badly she thought she might drop the guitar. And then, that first note. She had played in her room dozens of times since then, but it never felt the same as it had on that stage. That night, something in her had shifted. It wasn't just about playing music anymore. It was about sharing it, letting it belong to other people too. What surprised her most was how many others remembered it too. A week after the open mic, she was walking through the small downtown when she heard someone call out. It was the man with the gray hair from the front row. He crossed the street with a smile and told her, still thinking about that song, "I told my daughter about it. She wants me to take her next time you play." 2 days later, she ran into the young mother from the hall at the grocery store. The little girl was with her, holding her hand. The child tugged at her sleeve and said, "I drew you another picture." She handed over a crumpled sheet of paper from her backpack, another stick figure drawing of her on stage. But this time, with musical notes floating around her, even the teenager in the hoodie had found her on social media, sending a short message that read, "I'm trying guitar now, thanks." It wasn't fame, it wasn't headlines or sold-out shows, but it was connection. And that felt bigger than anything she'd imagined when she first sat in that corner, too scared to move. At night, she found herself replaying not just the song, but the faces. How some people had leaned forward, how some had closed their eyes. How the applause had felt like more than noise, it had felt like acceptance. The music teacher had been right when he told her she belonged up there. She could feel it now. The fear hadn't vanished completely. It still showed up when she thought too much about the next time. She might perform, but it didn't feel like a wall anymore. More like a small hurdle she knew she could step over if she just kept moving, and the memory of that final chord stayed with her. The way it had rung out and filled the room, the way silence had followed like it was part of the music itself. That silence had told her more than applause ever could. It told her they had listened, really listened. She hadn't planned to go back to the open mic so soon. But 2 weeks later, she found herself in front of the same wooden door. The hall looked the same from the outside. A little worn, a little ordinary, but inside. It felt like a place where something important had happened. When she stepped in, a few people recognized her. A man near the back raised his coffee cup in a small salute. The host gave her a knowing smile from across the room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was enough to make her feel like she was walking into a place where she belonged. As the night went on, and the list of performers slowly moved toward her name, she realized she wasn't gripping her guitar case as tightly this time. She still felt her heart beating faster, but it wasn't the panicked rhythm from before. It was excitement, and when she finally stepped on stage again, it didn't feel like stepping into a spotlight. It felt like stepping into a conversation she had started weeks ago, and was finally ready to continue. Later, when the night was over and people were leaving, she overheard two strangers talking near the door. "She's the one I told you about," one of them said. "The girl from the last time. I'm glad she came back," she smiled to herself, slipping the guitar back into its case. Months later, the video from that first night was still floating around online. It hadn't gone viral, in the way videos sometimes do. But it had found its way into corners of the internet, where people who needed it seemed to stumble upon it. Comments appeared under it now and then. "This made me cry in the best way. Reminds me of someone I miss. I wish I could have been there." And in a way, they were there. Every time someone pressed play, they were in that hall, sitting in one of those chairs, watching as a nervous girl in the corner found her courage and filled the room with music. It would never be just another night for her. It was the night she stopped telling herself she wasn't ready. The night she realized that fear wasn't a sign to stay away, it was a sign she was about to do something that mattered. And for the people who had been there, it wasn't just another performance they'd seen and forgotten. It was a memory. They carried a story they told about the quiet girl with the guitar who played one song and, for a few minutes, made the whole room hold its breath.